This is sanded down to 800 grit sandpaper. I started out with 240, I think, jumped up incrementally, finished off with 800 grit. The one problem I did have was pinholes that filled full of the powder from sanding this epoxy down. I couldn't get the powder out of those pinholes. I used high pressure air from my air hose and my air compressor, trying to blow it out like you would with when you're working in a body shop. Didn't want to work. I tried using that with a toothbrush and trying to work the dust out of the little pinholes. It worked somewhat, but not all the way. I didn't want to pour another layer of epoxy over that. Because I've got a black countertop and the dust from that stuff is white, I couldn't guarantee that it would soak up any of the next coat of epoxy and make it clear. So I got a bright idea to get my black stain, put it on a rag, and scrub it into those holes, into those pinholes, those white powder-filled pinholes. And what that did is it took the white powder and turned it black. So now instead of having a pinhole full of white powder, I have a pinhole full of black powder, which doesn't stand out nearly as much. You have to really get down and look for it to see it. Now they say as long as you use a water-based stain on your plywood or whatever you're staining, as long as a water-based stain fully dries, the epoxy will stick to it. What I don't know is if I use that water-based stain on top of a layer of epoxy and then put more epoxy over it, if that's going to affect anything. At this point, I'm just kind of in an experimental phase of this countertop. If it works, it works. If it doesn't, I guess I'll make another countertop. So I'm going to get ready to mix up another skim coat, and I'm going to use a spreader or a putty knife to smash it in these cracks right here, get it all leveled out and smooth so when I pour my flood coat, it doesn't have air bubbles coming up through some of these cracks.
Make sure your roller not too late.
Huh?
Just make sure your roller didn't have any dust on it.
No, I blew it off with the dust off of it. We've got a little warbly effect going on here, and I don't know what that's caused from. It might just be the fact that we couldn't temperature control. We have no heat and AC out here. There's no way to make it stay 75 degrees, which is what they recommend. So this might be just a process of curing as it heats up. The tabletop was, I think, 76 degrees when we did the pour, and the epoxy was 72 degrees. So it's really close. They say between 70 and 75. It was really close to the optimum temperature that they suggest. I don't think there's anything we could have done to prevent this from happening. This stuff is supposed to self-level and flow really nice so you don't have to sand it, but I'm going to go ahead and sand this stuff off because I want this to be glass smooth. So I'm going to start sanding this down with a really fine grit sandpaper, and then we're going to run a polisher over it, sand the drips off the bottom side, and go ahead and mount it in the house. So my uncured epoxy patches are, I'm finding an easy way to find them. This is uncured epoxy right here, how it's kind of white, and I'm using 80 grit sandpaper to find it. Basically, like right here is cured epoxy, right here is uncured epoxy. So just by going over it with a DA and sandpaper, you can find the uncured epoxy, and you can kind of feel it if you take your fingernails and kind of just scratch at it. Your fingernails will glide right over the cured epoxy. There's another patch right up here. It's probably out of the camera's view, but it's a little patch of uncured epoxy, and your fingernail will kind of dig into it without a lot of pressure. I don't know why this happened. We had 2 gallons of epoxy to pour on this countertop, and we mixed 2 gallons in 3 1-gallon jugs. And we took the 3 jugs and set them out, and we put a ½ gallon of hardener in 2 of them, a gallon of resin in 2 of them, mixed them for 3 minutes, poured half of each into that empty gallon, and then poured those 2 together. The 2 that we had originally been mixing, poured those 2 together. So now we have 2 different 1-gallon containers that we're mixing and scraping the sides and mixing. And then we took those 2 again and split into the 1 jug and then into another one. So we're again mixing all the resin together. We knew we had plenty of time to mix, so we used about 5 to 6 minutes of mixing and pouring into the different containers and making sure it's all the same batch. It comes in ½ gallon containers, and it's a 50-50 mix. So if you take the ½ gallon of resin and the ½ gallon of hardener and dump it in 1 container, that's a 50-50 or a 1-to-1 ratio. And since we were scraping the sides of the buckets as we're mixing and as we're dumping into each other, and we didn't scrape the sides as we were pouring, we shouldn't have gotten any uncured or unmixed epoxy or resin in this tabletop or countertop. I got to dig this out. I've got, I think, 1 more gallon of epoxy. We bought 4 gallons of epoxy to do this countertop when we only needed 2. We decided to get twice as much in case we needed some for something or another, problems like this. Hopefully it fixes it and we can get this countertop into our house sometime soon. I'm almost done sanding this stuff out, getting all the uncured epoxy out of this countertop. It's been a process. I've been working at it for, I'd say, 8 to 10 hours. Sanding, scraping, digging at it with my pocket knife, trying to make sure I get all of it out. I've got some interesting advice from this company, and after I got that advice, I went on the internet to see what other companies said, and some of the other companies are saying the same thing, which I don't agree with. Companies are saying that if you pour a countertop or a tabletop and you have pieces of uncured epoxy, one thing you can do is just buy more epoxy and flood coat the thing again. That doesn't work. I'll tell you that's not going to work. I'll tell you you're going to have problems with it later. You can't pour over uncured anything. If you have uncured epoxy and you pour over it, that uncured epoxy is kind of like a gel. It's, depending on how mixed it is, and how cured it got before it stopped curing, you're pouring over a gel, you're pouring over a liquid, and you're gonna have a hard surface over top of it, and maybe it's an 1/8 inch thick, which is pretty thick, but you're still asking for problems later. Something is gonna go wrong later. It's not gonna have the lifespan if it's done properly. So my advice, if anybody has uncured epoxy, is to sand it out, get it out of there, even if it means stripping the entire piece or starting from scratch and remaking it. I opted to sand it out, take 8 to 10 hours out of my life and work my butt off sanding this stuff out. I mean, I used a scraper, I used sandpaper, I used my pocket knife, I used a razor blade, I did everything I could to get all the uncured epoxy out of this. And I've got it feathered out pretty good. I don't feel any more uncured epoxy. I've still got some deep scratches to sand out and feather out so that hopefully when I re-flood this, you don't see scratches underneath that, you know, in between the layers. So got a little bit more prep work to do. I burnt through to the wood in a couple spots here, so I've got to put some stain down and let that dry real good before I do another flood coat. But I wanted to address mainly that fact that these companies are just telling you to pour over uncured epoxy, and I don't think that's right. I wouldn't do it. I wouldn't recommend doing it. If anybody out there has a problem with their epoxy countertop and somebody says, oh, we'll just flood another coat over it. Yeah, it'll work. You'll have a solid countertop over top of that gel, but think about it. You got uncured epoxy underneath it. I wouldn't. I'd make them do it right. So that's what I'm running into. It does take a lot of time and a lot of energy to get that uncured epoxy out. You can't just use sandpaper because it clogs the sandpaper really fast. You go through a lot of sandpaper trying to sand it out. I'm gonna sand out with some finer grit sandpaper some of these deeper scratches here that I see, and get some stain in a couple little spots, let it dry, and then we're gonna flood this thing over again and see how well it melts together. See if we can get this countertop to look good with all the problems we've had. Looks pretty good. I tried to feather out the side of it here so I wouldn't have a big lip. I've got a little bit of a lip right here, but that's about it. Everything else kind of smoothed out. A little bit of a low spot right here where the deep part was, that deep divot. But I think it's time to sand. It's been about maybe it's been 4 days now. It's been a long time. I've tried to be really patient with this so that it cures up really nice, really solid, and hopefully we don't have any more problems. So there's 2 ways I think I can do this, 2 different ways I can get the same effect. And what we want it to shine just like this, but we want it dead smooth as possible. So I need to sand it. This little dip here definitely needs to come out. I've got plenty of material to work with, so it shouldn't be a problem sanding it down smooth. But then to get that shine back in it, I can either mix up a tiny bit of epoxy and put it on with a rag. I've seen guys put it on with a rag, and that basically brings the shine back up. It puts just a thin layer of epoxy over the top, and it covers up all the scratches and makes it so you can just see through it again. It's perfectly shiny. Or I can sand it down to about 1200, 1500 grit and then polish it with a buffer. The only problem I foresee with a buffer is the buffer is going to introduce heat. And if any of this is not fully cured, that heat might disturb the whole process. So they say this epoxy doesn't fully cure for 30 days. and I really don't want to wait 30 days, guys. This is the countertop that makes my kitchen sink functional and my dishwasher functional and gives me another place to collect stuff, because that's what countertops are for. But I'm gonna start sanding this down real quick, and then I'm gonna make the decision on whether to buff it or mix up another small coat of epoxy and make it shine that way. Well, this sanded out really nice. It feathered out nice, it looks nice, it feels nice, nice and smooth. The only question now is whether I spend a few hours buffing it or if I mix up a little bit more epoxy and use the last roller I have to roll out a thin coat and let it dry for a couple days. It would be nice to have that extra coat on these edges. The edges still feel really thin. I'm not happy with this epoxy and the way it went over the edges. It feels like it all just, once it went over the edge, it just dripped off. It didn't feel like it left anything substantial there. So I'm gonna mix up some more epoxy and put a super thin coat on this. It's been about 3 or 4 hours. It's nice and cured, nice and hard. There are still a couple little drips and stuff on the sides that feel a little soft, but it's cured for the most part. I'm really not happy with this epoxy and the self-leveling feature of it. I don't know if all epoxies self-level the same way, but this definitely has like a heavy orange peel texture to it. It gives you a reflection, but it's not like a mirror. It's not like a glass smooth top. And maybe all epoxies are like this, but I don't know. So for my next projects, I have a couple of the projects. Number one, the other 2 countertops that I need to do. Now we picked this epoxy because it was rated at 500 degrees. Since our stove is right here, we could, if you forgot that you just got done cooking with that pot and you set it over here on the countertop, it wouldn't destroy the epoxy because it's got a high rating to it. Most of the other epoxies that are on the market that we saw were rated at 200 degrees. Now for our other 2 countertops, they're gonna be further away from the stove, and the stove being right next to the sink, you're probably not gonna take a pot and put it on a different countertop. So the other 2 countertops that we're gonna do, we can get a 200 degree rating, and I'm not gonna be too worried about setting something hot on it. So I'm gonna find a different brand of epoxy and see if the self-leveling gets a little more level. I am glad that I took the time to put another layer on this countertop because I got a chance to hit the edges. They feel a little bit thicker, a little bit nicer, smoother. So I am glad that I put this extra coat on. I'm gonna wait about 3 or 4 days and come out here and sand this down and polish it up so we can get it in the house. Until next time, guys, go make something.